I would like, if I may, to take you on a strange journey.
Welcome to the show, everybody. I've got a very special guest today for the first time on the show, a podcast that I've really come to enjoy. We share a lot of common interests. We share a lot of common friends in the podcasting world. I've got Callum Sinclair of Once Upon a VHS. Is that correct? Am I saying that right?
That's absolutely perfect. Yeah. Hello. Thank you so much for inviting me on.
Absolutely. So, yeah, your show now, you've been on the air for what, a little less than a year?
Yeah, we started in April, I think, looking at these 80s and 90s fantasy movies, many of which we grew up with, but we've made a lot of discoveries when we've been recording this series as well, which has been great fun. So when I say we, I'm talking about myself and my partner, Michael. When we first met over 20 years ago, Return to Oz was one of those films that we bonded over. And I think that mixture of creepiness and nostalgia and all of that kind of stuff really informs our taste in movies generally. So, again, we thought, why not? Why don't we record some of our stupid discussions about some of these films and put them out there for people to listen to? And people seem to be enjoying them. So, yeah.
I think one of the things I really like about it is the fact that you guys really speak my language in the 80s fantasy. I'm going to say like nightmare fuel-ish fantasy that we had in the 80s that we're afraid to dip our toes in anymore. I feel Hollywood and the entertainment industry is so cautious about what they put out there, trying to be super politically correct, not to piss off families, as if they think that is going to be the key to making things successful and financial. But here we are, 30, 40 years later, talking about these films that were way too mature for us as kids back in the day, but we loved them. It goes back to the thing that I've been saying all along, that you just have to treat children with a little bit more respect in terms of what their intelligence is, right? Like if you treat them more like adults, they're going to be more responsible and more mature in their thinking and their appreciation of things. I feel like there's generations below us that have just kind of been so watered down in like the tepid information and tepid storytelling that we've been giving them since, I'm going to say, like 1999. Something about that late 90s till now, it's like, why are we dumbing everything down? I mean, I got conspiracy theories for it, but that's not what this show's about. I feel like the people that really know how to get shit done were the people that were raised when Disney was dark, when Saturday morning cartoons were a little bit violent, a little bit witchy. Remember the old Ghostbusters cartoon talking about demonology and all that shit?
Yeah,
I think it made us more socially aware.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think things have become more risk averse nowadays. Yeah. And I think it is those swings and also those heightened emotions, whether that is fear or whether that is really kind of sad things. One of the first episodes that we do on the podcast is The Never Ending Story. And I think a lot of people are both scared by that, by things like the Gomorrah, but also really saddened by Artax, the horse, drowning in the swamp of sorrow. And these big emotions are things that we don't get so much in children's entertainment or family entertainment anymore. It's all been sort of, watered down, but I think there's much more of a leaning into comedy and lightness. And I think there's absolutely a place for that. But when people say, oh my God, I was scarred for life by watching whatever film as a kid, I also think, well, you remembered that. You know, that was something that made an impression on you. And that probably informed your interactions with other people, how you treat people, maybe made you think about kindness, maybe made you think about how you deal with dangerous situations. So I think, some of that has been lost. The educational quality of some of these 80s fantasy films and that darkness that's in them.
Well, and then when did things stop being metaphorical, right? Like when you think about all of these shows that we were raised on, or just like Grimm's fairy tales, classic literature, things like that, they all kind of had like a parable, metaphorical leaning to them where something scary or something sad actually was a reflection on something that you were going to deal with in your mature life. The big bad wolf is like stranger danger, right? Things like that. We stopped thinking metaphorically because for some reason, some suit in a studio thought that kids weren't going to get it. It was going to go over their head. So let's give them something to be more just entertained and brain rotted by, right? We're going to put them in front of the TV so they can just absorb whatever content we're giving them so mommy and daddy can go work. We stopped giving things to scare kids and to think about. And that is one of the things, and it's not just us. It's, I would say, all around the world, people have really dumbed down and watered down their entertainment. I mean, I remember growing up, you guys over there had a lot of fun cartoons and animated shows. Super Ted. Remember Super Ted?
Yes, yeah, and the Spotty Man.
They and Danger Mouse. You guys had some like dark metaphorical cartoons over there. A lot of them had a lot of political leanings, and then you don't see stuff like that anymore. It became too dangerous. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I'm so pleased that you brought up Super Ted. Kind of relevant to the films that we're talking about today. The idea of this manufactured character who is thrown away like a piece of rubbish. It's like, whoa, you didn't have to go that deep. Thank you, Super Ted. Yeah, it's great fun, but there's also this inherent sadness and melancholy to it. I think that's the quality that is really missing from a lot of kids entertainment, family entertainment that we had back then, is melancholy, and that nightmare fuel quality that you talked about before as well.
I feel like now if we have melancholy or emotional moments in movies, they feel so manufactured that we don't even take them seriously anymore. Like, okay, here is the quintessential moment where we're supposed to cry. You know, we have the music swelling up, the characters on screen get the tears in their eyes. It's just very manufactured. We don't get that emotional punch from nuance anymore, and I miss it. So anyway, before we get off into that tangent, let's kind of talk about what this episode is about. I sent you a list of episodes, and you picked the one about nightmare fuel or did I dream this type films. And it kind of took a sidestep into something different because we talked about the film I had on the list called KONRAD, which is this 1985 TV movie about an instant boy, an instant child. And then that put us into another tangent of like, well, what about AI, artificial intelligence, where it's almost like a delivery child, right? You can't have a child, so you're going to have a company make one for you. And it's supposed to be emotionally attached for you. And can humans emotionally attach themselves to that? And so it kind of put us on this path of take away children. They get delivered to your door. They are mechanically or biologically engineered and conditioned to love humans. And just that on its own, I feel is nightmare fuel territory.
Absolutely. And also something that I think we have to reckon with at this point where we are in the advances in technology. It's maybe not as much of a stretch as it was even 20 years ago, you know?
Well, in the time that you and I decided to do this episode, from conception till now, here we are recording a couple months later, we had that crazy like Tesla announcement of these Tesla robots that are supposed to be living in your house and doing chores for you. I think most of it's bullshit. I think it was like a PR stunt, but that doesn't mean that it's not coming, and sooner than we probably think.
It's on its way. Kim Kardashian's getting pictured holding hands with it, you know?
Well, then it's definitely going to sell.
Yeah.
So before we get into that conversation, I want to do what I'm going to call a calibration with you, because I already tell we're simpatico. We can tell by the episodes you've done, the shows and movies that you guys appreciate and recognize. So I want to see how close we really are. I got 4 questions for you to kind of calibrate the episode, all regarding your genre, 80s fantasy films, okay? So We'll just start off with the very first one. Super easy, should be. What is your favorite 80s fantasy film?
Okay, I've already given it a name check in this episode, but it has to be Return to Oz.
Yeah, it underrated, financial bomb when it came out. I've talked about it on the show several times, and it's one that I love showing people because there's a lot of people, if you weren't born in the 80s or 90s, it was really easy for you to miss this one because no one really cared about it.
It got buried, didn't it? I think Disney deliberately buried it. There was a changeover in the studio execs at the time of its release, so they didn't put a lot of effort into promoting it. I think they knew what they had on their hands was something that was really challenging in terms of the content. For those who aren't familiar with it, it starts off with Dorothy, our heroine from The Wizard of Oz, being taken by her family for electroshock treatment to stop her from talking about Oz because they think that she's been mentally disturbed, and she's locked in this asylum essentially, and then she escapes into a version of the Land of Oz which is dark and broken and gothic and full of all of these frightening characters like the Wheelers and Mombi, this witch who can exchange her heads, and the Gnome King. It's just absolutely beautiful production design. Really, it has a feel and it has a tangibility to it that, again, we just don't get so much these days. The sets, the props, the fact that you've got these claymation characters in the mix. It's a really beautiful film, and also it appeals to that idea of something that you're familiar with from your childhood being distorted in a way. You know, it sort of plays with that nostalgia about the Judy Garland 1939 MGM film, but it presents things in a whole different context. So I think for those reasons, amongst others, it's a real favorite.
I could say that the next question could be the same answer. For me, it definitely would be. But what would you say your favorite nightmare fuel film of the 80s is?
Yeah, I mean, Return to Oz fits the bill for that too. But I do want to mention The Never-Ending Story here.
Agreed, yeah.
Because that creature, the Gmork, this frightening wolf-like monster that pops out of the shadows and attacks one of our heroes, that is just a frightening thing. But also the philosophical concept of the nothing, this big existentialist threat of just everything that you know and love being consumed into this darkness, and there's nothing you can do about it. You only have to hold on to hope. Like as both as a child and as an adult, rewatching The Never-Ending Story, that is genuine nightmare fuel distilled into its purest form, I think.
Well, going back to the idea of like the metaphors that they were expressing to us, it's a metaphor for the end of childhood. It really is. Is as you are going into the world of being an adult, you're letting all of the fantastical notions of your childhood go, and that's what the nothing is. It's something that we deal with in everyday life, but at the same time, a movie made it frightening. We're like, oh, we are dealing with the fact that we are ending our fantasy world of childhood, and now we're just a number and a cog in a machine, right? 100% agree on that one. Okay, 80s guilty pleasure film. Something that may not be for everyone's taste, but it just tickles your fancy.
Okay. For this one, I'm going to pick Ridley Scott's 1985 Legend.
Love it.
Which, again, just absolutely gorgeous production design. So much glitter.
I think they're still breathing it in like 40 years later.
I think so. Like, I think they, check him when he's coughing, see if glitter is sort of coming out of his mouth. It is such a gorgeous, lavish, over-the-top production, but the story is pretty thin. It's sort of a generic fairy tale, a pastiche almost. It's like kind of gluing together all the various kind of parts of different fairy tales, and it's quite an archetypal story. But it's brought to life in such a serious and earnest way. You've got all of these fairy characters. You've got Tim Curry, the legendary Tim Curry, as this devilish creature, this massive demon of darkness with these big horns and this red prosthetic makeup, and just hamming it up. It's it's glorious, and it just is reveling. The film feels like it's reveling in the fantasy of it all, and it just loses itself and has unicorns and all this cherry blossom flying about, and it's not the most mentally stimulating film in the world. It's eye candy, and it appeals to something inside you. I think there's just a base level, like, oh, this is fantasy,
Well, and it's horny too. Like
Oh,
you
yeah.
you can tell that they really wanted to go a lot further with the sexuality for it, but they're like, oh wait, but this is supposed to be a kids movie. But it's still, I mean, I know a lot of people that still talk about how they want to bang the devil or Mia Sarah. Like it's definitely a horny movie.
Yeah, Mia Sarah, like, transformed into this gothic princess. You've also got Tom Cruise in his little tunic with his
Right?
thighs out.
Showing a lot of
You've
thigh.
got the big devil. Yeah, I know. It's like there's something for everybody.
All right, and my last question for you is don't bring up this 80s movie around me. Which 80s fantasy movie do you just absolutely hate or can't believe that some people actually like?
Ooh, that's a good question. I guess one of the films that I'm sort of less impressed with is Highlander.
Oh, okay. That is a debate because there's people that think it's
Yeah.
garbage and there's some people who think it's like scripture. It's a weird one to talk about.
Yeah, I can see the appeal of it, but it's just sort of not for me. I think some of the movies that are a bit more testosterone fueled,
Mhm.
things like Beastmaster, or that kind of thing, like, that are just a little bit more of that brainless action side of things,
Right.
are less in my wheelhouse. Not to say that Highlander's brainless, but I feel like there are fewer of the sort of supernatural elements and the visual beauty that I look for in 80s fantasy
Mhm.
stuff. So yeah, I guess I'm not a massive hater of Highlander, but that was the first thing that kind of popped into my mind as
You just
one that,
can't understand like its mass appeal for some. Like some people
yeah,
like live and die on that hill. And they live on
yeah,
live and die on the hill of the sequels too, which I'm just like, what?
yeah. I haven't checked out any of the sequels, but
You're good.
I know that
You're fine.
yeah.
Awesome, cool. That gives me a little bit more in tuneness with what you are bringing to the table, and I agree with all of those 100%. I think that Highlander is a noble attempt at concept, but execution, I just don't think it's there. I really don't.
I haven't revisited Highlander since I was, maybe about 14, 15.
Hmm.
So maybe I will see other things in it. We will cover it at some point on the podcast. But being a Scotsman as well, I feel like I should, I should feel some kind of connection to it. Maybe that's in the mix too.
Maybe, or the fact that they have a Welshman, Sean Connery, play like a Spanish Egyptian guy. I think that's another interesting concept as well. But whatever.
Yeah. There can be only one.
Right, there can be. Okay, let's go. AI. Now, this is a film that I think Spielberg. There's a lot of love and hate for it. I think it's grown in its appreciation over time. It was a real interesting time for Spielberg because coming out of the '90s and out of the fantasy, he really kind of dipped his toe hard back into the world of science fiction, but almost like a dystopian type of science fiction. You have this, and then you go right into Minority Report, which I think is a better film. That's not to say that this one isn't a great film. I think it's got a lot of positives and a lot of negatives. To me, the part that made me the most excited about it when it was coming out was the idea that it was originally a Stanley Kubrick idea and concept, which eventually he gave to Spielberg. I think a lot of people think that, oh, well, Kubrick died and Spielberg just took over. That wasn't really the case. They were incommunicado very strongly about this project, where Kubrick put a lot of it together for decades, and it was like, you know what, this doesn't really feel like me, maybe you should do it. And then after his passing, Spielberg did take the reins and included a lot of the ideas from Kubrick, but also you can't not make a Steven Spielberg film without Steven Spielberg elements to it. What was your first reaction to this when you saw it?
So I saw this not in cinemas, not at release, but would have been shortly after. It would have been with the home video DVD release. And even at that young age, I had a familiarity with Spielberg's work. I'd seen 2001: A Space Odyssey. I think I had seen The Shining as well. So I kind of had a bit of a sense of Kubrick's coldness and objectiveness compared to Spielberg's warmth and family and all of the stuff that we kind of associate with Spielberg. But this film to me doesn't quite feel like either of them. There are moments, there are flashes of both of them. This feels like it's a film written and directed by somebody from another planet. It doesn't quite feel like either of them. And it taps into what I respond to with those 80s fantasy films in many ways. I would say that, yeah, Minority Report absolutely is much harder sci-fi. This is like a blend of science fiction and fairy tale and fantasy to me. And that was the aspect of it that resonated with me most as a kid, was that this was sort of a take on Pinocchio. There's overt references to Pinocchio throughout and the significance of the blue fairy and granting Pinocchio's wish. But also visually, so much of it reminded me of those nightmare fuel films like Return to Oz and The Never-Ending Story, particularly the sequence with the flesh fair and all of these broken robots, and just the visual appeal of it and the uncompromising emotional qualities of it as well. It is a deeply moving film if you're in a particular mindset, I think, and it floored me as a young person watching that film, and the philosophical considerations of it, like the ethical questions that this film raises. It blew my mind when I was younger, and I knew that it probably wouldn't be a film that I would want to revisit very often, because it's sort of draining to watch.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to put it, because up until, I'm going to say, like Schindler's List, right? Spielberg films were highly rewatchable. I want to say that that's probably one of the reasons why he became so prolific in the 80s and early 90s, is you could just watch Spielberg films over and over again, like listening to a Beatles album. He just knew how to play the hits, right? He knew how to play those notes that were going to get you emotionally and make you feel good. Those sweeping cinematic shots that just kind of resonate in your brain, like, oh, I want to see that shot again. I want to see that hero of the movie smile and grin and smirk again. He really knew how to capture that. And then I think he did have an existential crisis in the early 90s. Hook was a failure for him. He didn't like that experience. He bounced back with Jurassic Park, huge, and then became very personal with his Schindler's List film, which is as emotionally draining as Schindler's List is. You can rewatch it quite a bit because the human element to it of like, oh, this is such a terrible thing that happened, but then the rise up in humanity and the strength of the people, it's addictive. It wants you to watch it again. And so for the rest of the 90s, I feel like he was really trying to figure out what he wanted to be or where he wanted to go as a filmmaker. And there's that touch of nihilism in this film that it almost feels like he's giving up who he was as a filmmaker before, right? I think Lost World definitely was something for the audiences to be like, okay, so now he's just a hack. He's just kind of hacking himself, and he's just making this box office bait with the dinosaurs again. It's really cheesy. It's really hokey. And I think this was kind of his answer to that. It's like, okay, I'm one of the most prolific filmmakers ever, and I'm having an existential crisis. And this film really speaks to me about humanity and what it means and how terrible it can be, and what nihilism is on film, and portraying it in a fairy tale aspect, I think is why it does feel different. It doesn't feel like a Spielberg movie because I don't think it's Spielberg at his best. I feel like it's him trying to do something new. And then once he gets his feet underneath him with it, Minority Report is his next step, which goes back to that idea of feeling like a Spielberg movie. So I think it's really transformational for a lot of people involved in this. It was transformational for the Kubrick concept. It was transformational for Steven Spielberg. And it was transformational for Haley Joel Osment, who, coming off of one of the biggest horror films ever, The Sixth Sense, was that lightning in a bottle, or was that something that could have been, prolonged and maintained performance-wise. And I think he's amazing in this. However, I think the detriment to it is he does seem too otherworldly and not relatable because he is a robot. And I think that does affect his career after this movie, or of like, is this even a real person? Maybe he's just too good at playing mechanical. And it almost speaks to the metaphor of the movie. Can we love this character? Or are we just along with the ride for him to discover or not he can be human?
Haley Joel Osment is one of the best. It's surely one of the best child actor performances that there has ever been. But I absolutely agree that perhaps that uncanny aspect of, is this even a human being that we're watching, maybe damaged his career in some respects. And I know that Kubrick was originally envisioning that this character be played by an actual animatronic, and they did some tests with that, and it just did not work. And I think that was one of the things that made Kubrick throw his hands up and say, actually, can this even be made at all? Like, we'll never find a child who is capable of carrying this film. And they did. And honestly, he is both creepy, and I think that he is really moving in those latter scenes of the film. But there is that layer of disconnect where we know that this is a machine, this is not a human. And as much as by the end of the film he's moved from having the perfectly smooth hair and appearance and whatnot, and he's a bit ruffled and tousled by the end of the movie and seems more human, there's always going to be that disconnect, I think, for us as an audience from a robotic character, I guess.
I think one of the things that makes this movie unique is the idea that we are dealing with, for the first 30 minutes of the movie, David has not been emotionally switched on to become attached to the parents yet. He is just factory model, right? He's right off the sales floor. He has his base directives, his prime objectives, whatever, to learn, to question, but there's no emotional attachment. And he plays that really well. And so then once his mother turns that on, and then now he is a child in love with his mother. The thing that I think disturbed me so much when I watched this the first time in the theater is the idea that obsession oftentimes can be confused with love. And the programming of that is what's scary. Because as we are born, we are immediately and physiologically attracted to our parents. We love them. We need them. And here we have an artificial sense of that. Whoever designed him didn't design him just to love. He designed him to be obsessed, because that perception of programming of love is so objectionable, right? It really is on whoever is actually doing that program. So you're really just getting that person's idea of love. It made me kind of like deconstructive, like, okay, well, some of the most lonely people in the world are engineers because all they're doing is working. And their idea of love is whatever kind of, I'm not going to say obsession, but whatever kind of emotional satisfaction they get outside of work. So it can be confusing to like, what does love really mean? You have to go back and think that his idea of love is whatever he was programmed to be. And in this case, it kind of feels obsession-like. And that's why it's disturbing, because it's a computer, and we're attached to it and we like it, but at the same time we're afraid of it because we see what those obsessions do. It causes violence, it causes pain, it causes destruction in the family unit. And I don't think a lot of people in the audience knew how to absorb that, which is why people kind of repel against this movie sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is making us think about those limitations of artificial intelligence, and that as a designed being, or mentality, however you want to put it, that is still going to have its boundaries, and it's not organic. It doesn't come together in the way that love does and should, as the result of human experience. And it is frightening, those moments where he goes in on instruction from his brother Martin. Right. Martin tells David, this robot, "Oh, mommy would love you more if you cut a lock of her hair. And it is frightening seeing David with the scissors going in. The parents are scared when they wake up. They say, "What the hell are you doing?" And just seeing that, seeing how even as benign as his intention might be, how that can be distorted by bad faith actors, I suppose.
Right.
It is frightening. And yeah, again, it is going to cause that bit of remove from, this isn't a human being that we're watching. This is something entirely different. And I don't know how to process that. And I think that's one of the reasons why, yes, this movie has been to some extent critically reevaluated, but I wanted to bring this movie to the table as a cult-worthy podcast, because I feel like it has the elements of a cult film, but perhaps because of this uncanny aspect of the character where they're sort of human, but they're not quite human, it just hasn't caught on as a cult favorite, even though it has all of these different things that just make you think, why isn't this like a massive favorite for people?
I think too, like I have this debate with people all the time saying, oh, well, a big budget Hollywood production cannot be a cult favorite. I'm like, absolutely it can. Because yeah, this made some money, but it's not considered like high tier Spielberg. It does have a lot of hate against it and a lot of people that love it. I'd say between this and 1941, those are two of the biggest cult opportunistic films in Spielberg's catalog. Okay, so this is one of the things I really think we need to talk about with this film. So the Pinocchio analogies and metaphors are just, they're thick, right? This really is a Pinocchio thing. He even has his own Jiminy Cricket, in a sense, which is the little super toy Ted. That's my favorite character of the movie. If anything, I think this is just as much Ted's movie as it's David's movie. I think it's one of the most effective characters in a film like this. I think it helps us relate to David better. And the reason why is because just like this guy right here, it's marketable. It's merchandisable. It's something that we as a entertainment and media absorbing culture can identify with. It's the cute, fuzzy character that's got a lot more going for it than we think it does. And without Ted, David's lost. Without Ted, there isn't a movie. He's David's conscience. He's David's kind of like protector in a sense. And at the end of the day, he's along for the entire ride with David. Now, did you ever read the original story that this was based on?
I did. Super Toys Last All Summer Long by Brian Aldiss. Yeah, it's funny because this whole movie has been expanded and extrapolated from what would only really be like a couple of short scenes.
Yeah.
From the film. That those are the only parts that are kind of a direct adaptation. And really, with that short story, the twist is that David is a robot. It's more about Teddy and the fact that he's playing with this toy, and those scenes in the movie where David is writing the letters to Monica, the mother, saying, "Oh, Martin and I are brothers and we love mommy, and Teddy is not one of us." And it's that not understanding that he's human, but Teddy as something that is unashamedly a creation.
Or artificial,
It is very artificial. But the fact that he's a grounding influence and he has this gruff voice provided by Jack Angel, and he warns David, "Don't eat, you will break."
You'll break, David.
Love his voice.
I think that's one of the things that the movie, I feel, fails at, is the original story, as short as it is, does have that like Rod Serling Twilight Zone twist to it that we don't get in this film. And when I read the story after the movie, and I was like, I want to see that movie. I want to see the movie where we don't know that David is artificial, that we are really attached to this character who has contempt for the robot, has contempt for Teddy, and then discover that, well, he was artificial all along. I don't know why the change happened. I think that expanding this movie, because my biggest complaint about this film is that there's too much of it, that they really force a lot of unnecessary scenes to build attachment to this character and share the stakes and danger, and that's a detriment. For one thing, there's too many endings. And I think that was its biggest complaint with the critics of the day, is like, okay, you have ending 1, you have ending 2, you have ending 3. Like, okay, how? And I think that continues now, where films don't know where to properly end. And now they don't only end, we also have like mid and end credit sequences added to it where you have to stay the whole time. But there's always been that argument with me, is that I think the film would have been perfect, because I'm a downer, that the film would have ended when David falls off the building into the water. Done. Okay, well then he gets rescued by Gigolo Joe. Great performance, by the way, by Jude Law. And then he gets stuck under the water. Okay, he's in front of the blue fairy. I think that's poignant. He found the blue fairy. End credits. Perfect. But then we got to go another step and have the, let's say, epilogue to it, where he's now thousands of years in the future, and artificial intelligence is now the prominent existence on the planet, and he gets his happy ending. Like, that was my biggest complaint, and still is to this day, is that there's too many endings with too many emotional experiences. Like, they're trying to make too many people happy with how they conclude the movie.
See, I think that's interesting. I absolutely agree generally around ending fatigue, right? But I really like that epilogue. I think that it's actually a darker and more nihilistic ending than just leaving it with David on the deep dive with the blue fairy, because it doesn't hold your hand. I absolutely understand why this ending is divisive and a lot of people don't like it, but I think some people see it as being a bit mawkish and a bit sentimental. The fact that these advanced AIs from the future aren't able to actually give David what he really wants, which is his actual mother. Yeah, it's a replica. Just like he's a replica of an actual child, it's a replica of his home. It's not quite right. It's not quite his mother. But that is enough for David to find peace and essentially die happily. There's a real bittersweetness to that, and a tonal weirdness that I really respond to, because it's not happy, and it's not a deeply depressing ending either. But there is something so dark about that ending to me, and so sincere about, we're gonna leave you on this place of David and the mother cuddling in the bed, and they both die. But Teddy's still going, but you know, fuck Teddy.
I want to see that sequel. Like, Teddy is now like the ruler of the AI planet in the future. Yeah. I think at the end of the day, with this film, I like it. I do like it a lot. I like it more than I liked it originally in the theater. I didn't watch it for a good, 15, 16 years, just because it left a bad taste in my mouth once I saw it. But then, thank you for podcasts and internet forums and chat rooms and things like that, where it's like, okay, now I can get other people's opinions and how they look at this film, and bring some insights that I didn't really think of before. And we're having a conversation about it now, where it's like, okay, I really do think it is an underrated and underappreciated attempt at something that seems more relevant now in 2024 than it did in 2002, 2001, right?
Yeah, it's such an ambitious film. Not only visually, you've got effects, like practical effects by Stan Winston, and CGI that still looks really good today, but also thematically, like we talked about at the very outset of this episode, you just don't get studios taking the risks that this film makes. You've got what it could be marketed as a family movie, right? But you've got a sex robot as one of the main characters. You've got the mother completely rejecting this synthetic child. You've got a Las Vegas of fucking blowjob head architecture. I'm like, pretty cool. What on earth is going on? Yeah.
Yeah, I think if they were to make this film these days, it would probably be like a Pixar movie, right? It'd be all CG. They wouldn't attempt to make an actual live action blend of special effects and performance. And I'm glad. I'm glad this movie exists. You know, I'm glad that it still is out there in the zeitgeist enough for people to recognize it and reappreciate it. And plus, Spielberg hasn't had a lot of hits lately. I feel like he's become very monotone in what he's doing, and it's fun to go back and watch I'd say the three films of the early 2000s, this, Minority Report, and Catch Me If You Can, where I feel like he really got his energy back. And it's that to me, it's like a perfect little trilogy of Spielberg's like second rebirth.
Yeah. I do like West Side Story and Meet the Fablemans. I think I can see the sort of groove that he'd sort of settled into with those. But when I watch something like Ready Player One, I'm like, what is this? Like, you were capable of stuff like AI and Minority Report. Like, where has that gone? So yeah, I guess time will tell with his future projects. But I would really ask people, if you have been curious about revisiting AI, I would really encourage watching it, as long as you are in the right state of mind to be potentially devastated. So
agreed. Okay, so now moving on to the second pick, which is the one I had on the list, the very obscure film. And I'm glad that you picked this, because I've been dying to talk about it with somebody other than myself, because I find myself keep writing like blogs and essays about mostly these kind of films in the 80s, not necessarily this film. But it goes back to that, like, did I dream this movie, the nightmare fuel of the 80s? And that's 1985's KONRAD. Now, I'm not sure how old you are. I'm 43. I saw this movie back in 86 or 87 when I was in grade school. It was one of those movies that if you had a substitute teacher, they would wheel in a cart with a TV and a VCR, and they just play movies for you, right? Just whatever was in the school library. And that's where I first saw this. And it definitely is nightmare fuel when you think of it from a 6 or 7-year-old's point of view. And then you watch it as an adult, like, oh, well, this is just like a cheesy made-for-TV kids movie. But it's got some elements to it that are way darker and way more mature than I would say a 6 or 7-year-old now could accept or appreciate. And that's what I love about the 80s, is we didn't care. Like, we were making stuff like this. So while it's shot and filmed like a TV special for kids, it's got elements of darkness, of runaway capitalism and consumerism, a loneliness, but also this idea that we are tampering with genetics and sociological and psychological behavior. KONRAD is an instant child. He is made in a factory full of incubators. And then these kids are conditioned and brainwashed to be perfect. And the idea of this is like, we want to give you a manufactured perfect child delivered to your door in a Return of the Living Dead zombie container, essentially, that you break the seal and pour nutrient elements on them so they can grow back to being a normal child. That's the premise.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty full on. There are those little subversive elements in there. There's a real theme of anti-authoritarianism. It is dealing with that idea of eugenics, I guess, and creating these perfect children. Because interestingly, I had vague memories of KONRAD. Growing up in the UK, they did occasionally show, I think this is a Canadian film, isn't it?
It is.
They occasionally showed, during like daytime. So this would be if I was off sick from school. Sometimes they showed like these imported films, just during the day.
Right.
And I had vague memories of watching this. I also had vague memories of Daryl, which is another 80s movie about a sort of robotic child, which I could have suggested in addition to AI. But my memory of KONRAD was that it was about this sort of robot boy that came to live with somebody. But what is very important, a distinction to make, is that KONRAD isn't a robot. KONRAD is a human child who has been developed and processed into being something for mass consumption. And I think that watching the two films back to back, that distinction became like really significant.
Oh, it's perfect. The fact that you recommended AI, because in the film AI, and also in the original story that it's based on, is like in the future, as economics and resources are dwindled, you have the regulation of only having like 1 or 2 children, but also there is a fertility problem, so some people can't even have children, and that's why they are developing these super toys, these super children. That is almost hand in hand with what this instant child factory is doing. It's almost as if they're seeing a future where people won't be able to reproduce, or there'll be a limit to what they can reproduce. So kids can't have families can't have 5 or 6 kids. So they have these instant children originally developed for people who can't have children, but also we know how economics works. It could be like, oh, well, this is just the future of the human race. And by doing this, we can program the human race to be exactly what we want it to be through brainwashing and programming, and everything has to be perfect and intelligent. So when they come into these homes, they are now smarter and more developed than the people who are supposed to be taking care of them. There's a darkness to it that they do not really talk about in the movie.
There really is. And I like to have a little look at what the background, what the sort of social and political culture changes and shifts were happening at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying this as a criticism of IVF, but I know that the first human baby born through IVF was in 1978. Mm-hmm. And at the time, I remember there being a lot of talk about these test tube babies. You know, that was the term that was bandied about. And there's even a line in this film, all the rules of human reproduction will change.
It's true.
I'm not a parent myself, but like as somebody in a queer family, you know, I'm not going to be raising a child in quote unquote the natural way of things, you know. And there's a lot to think about with this movie, but it kind of uncomfortably joins that concept together with eugenics and the programming and brainwashing of children into being these perfect citizens, I suppose. But that's in contrast to our lead character in this, Bertie Bartolotti, played by Polly Holliday, who is just wonderful in this role. I think she brings so much to this movie, and she is such a mess and so counter to this idea of what the ideal citizen would be in many ways. She's a free spirit. She does what she wants. She sits about eating her Cheetos and chocolate syrup, lounging about in her purple moo-moo. She's very relatable to me.
It's funny that you mentioned that, because the ideas that we've been hearing lately politically about, you know, how women these days, modern women, have different priorities than they did back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, where, you know, the conservative right here in the States call them like single cat ladies, right? Well, that's what Bertie Bartolotti is. She's a single cat lady. So the conflict of the movie, but also I could say the springboard for the premise, is the fact that KONRAD is delivered to her by mistake. So what happens when a single cat lady who makes rugs on the side for whatever money she can get from them, who's a free spirit, gets this instant child? And it's a great scene where we are introduced to both of them, where KONRAD's delivered. She opens a container and he's like a raisin. He's a little
gremlin.
She calls him a gremlin, which of course is hilarious because she's in the movie Gremlins. She gets launched out the window, but she, in a panic because the computer is telling her to pour the nutrient solution, and KONRAD pops out, played by Huckleberry Fox. He's a cute little kid. He's great in this movie. And that dynamic they have between them, where it's like it's someone with a puppy for the first time. She doesn't know what to feed it. She doesn't know what to do with it. She wraps him up in a rug, essentially, because there's no clothes. That's such a charming thing, and it's not forced upon us that they have to have an immediate emotional connection. At first, she doesn't know what to do with it. The whole idea is that she's imperfect, and KONRAD is perfect, and she teaches them that it's okay to not be perfect. You can make mistakes. You should make mistakes. And he is bringing out a maternal side in her that she didn't know she had. Okay, is that a little bit forced metaphor? A little bit, but the performances and the way these characters are written, it doesn't matter how cheesy the movie plays. This works. The fact that they find each other, that works. It's the same thing in AI that I was complaining about, how we don't really feel that David gets a good connection with anybody because it's artificial. He's programmed to love. He's not taught to love, where these two learn how to love together. That's the difference between the two movies.
Yeah, absolutely. And they are just so charming. And it's funny that you mentioned that activation scene with the dried up, kind of desiccated gremlin form of KONRAD arriving. It reminded me of Black Mirror's episode Be Right Back. Have you seen that?
Yes.
Yeah, this sort of dried up facsimile of a human being, I suppose, that you have to pour the water and the nutrients on. And that to me was the the big nightmare fuel moment of the whole thing was the tape instructions getting more and more frantic, telling her, pour the nutrient solution over the contents of this container immediately. And like that, ratcheting it up. And Barty's like, what is going on here? You know, she's freaking out about the situation.
Right, like what would happen if she didn't, you know?
Yeah.
She's already popped the seal on that thing. Like what would happen to Conrad if she chose not to? Again, there's some darkness there.
Mm-hmm.
I got a question for you, because we bring in Ned Beatty, who I just love in everything. He plays Mr. Thomas. He's essentially her only friend. He is a musician. He owns a music shop, and he becomes like the paternal, fatherly character to Conrad. Now, this is something I didn't recognize when I saw this earlier, because honestly, I was too young. But you being in the lifestyle you're in, the podcast being the way it is, do you think there's some queer coding to his character? Because I see it now.
Let me tell you, Mr. Thomas is a prissy old queen, and don't let nobody tell you otherwise. Honestly, that is in my notes. It's all over my notes. He's got, yes, the violin is the queen of the orchestra. He is absolutely queer coded. And I think to some extent, Barty, and not only in the childless, quote unquote, childless cat lady, single cat lady idea, although Barty's got this husband who's run away to the Himalayas to do whatever bums do in the Himalayas.
Right.
There is something that feels, kind of a bit counterculture about Barty, and it's not surprising that she's close friends with Mr. Thomas. I really like the pairing of these two characters together. And like you say, Ned Beatty, obviously the pairing of Polly Holiday and Ned Beatty is just such a dynamic duo. I love those two.
My favorite scene in the movie is when they decide that they want to parent him together, and they have a negotiation, essentially, of like, okay, well, we're not romantically involved with each other, but we both want the best for Conrad. So how can we make this work without, expecting romantic exchanges with each other, right? And they're talking about, okay, well, which days can we get them? You can have them every Wednesday, every Sunday, but we can hang out every day and play music together. Like, that's such a cute little scene. That's like there's a lot of fluff in this movie, but that scene is really interesting because it shows that these two people, I feel like that is what a lot of couples need these days, is like, hey, you can sit down and you can negotiate how you want to spend your time and how you want to spend your emotions. And it doesn't have to be transactional, but it does show that you have a plan of how you're going to divide these responsibilities and duties, and especially if there's a child involved, so one person doesn't feel overstimulated or neglected in how much they're doing. I think it's a really interesting scene. But also, it shows that, and you can attest to this, that love is love, right? It doesn't have to be a romantic attachment. The fact that you can have a relationship with a child that's not yours biologically, and with a person that's going to help you with this child that is maybe not the same as you romantically or attractiveness or sexuality, it is just about emotion. And I think that is what makes this movie work better for me than AI did, because AI is a lack of emotions, artificial emotion, where this film is 100% about, like, it doesn't matter if you're genetically connected or legally connected. You can have that love is love experience. It played on a whole different level now as an adult than it did when I was a kid.
Yeah. That's the thing. It absolutely goes hand in hand with that theme in the film of, love doesn't have to look a particular way. Things don't have to be a particular way. And one of the other scenes that really stood out to me was when Barty is painting with Conrad, and Conrad gets sort of stressed out to the extent that Conrad can, because he's splashed paint all over the place and he's got it on his outfit. And Barty reframes that as, listen, this can be your dye mixing outfit. Putting things in a positive way and just making the best of what we've got, and showing love and showing, what is actually important here, And I think that scene in particular really moved me, that painting scene, because it didn't hang a hat on it, but that's what this film is all about. It doesn't have to be any particular way. It doesn't have to conform to external conventions. It can just be about love and doing what is right for that person.
And then the darkness that seeps in at the end, in the third act, where Conrad is recalled and taken back to the factory. And the production value isn't great because it's an 80s TV movie, but just the idea that we have this factory where children are incubated, they're programmed and processed, and then they're dehydrated and shipped out. It doesn't matter what the production value is. The darkness to that is very evident. And the fact that Max Wright, who's like our main antagonist slash anti-hero, he's 100% the representation of like runaway capitalism, where it's like we don't even care that these are humans, these are products. You know, it goes to the idea where it's like we're not people, we are just numbers, right? In the grand scheme of things, I think it definitely plays on that metaphor. But the idea that we see that these kids are being Pink Floyd, The Walled processed, right, and they're just being indoctrinated and sold off to rich people, and if they don't be successful, if they are not a good product or a behaving product, they are recalled and recycled. Now, the movie is whimsical. The dialogue is dark. And to me, that makes it even more disturbing. If this was like a mustache twirling villain, it would feel more sincere. But the fact that this is just a emotionless, heartless, capitalistic guy just throwing out the ideas of recalling and recycling human beings willy-nilly, that is the darkness there.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a very interesting moment, I think, that is played for laughs, but it speaks to that theme, which is where a couple of kids that Conrad is friends with from school, one of whom is this boy called Frank, they come to that facility, that factory, I guess, where the instant children are created, where Conrad is being held. And somebody says of Frank, that is the worst looking instant child I ever saw, which again is like, it's a joke, it's funny, it's played for laughs, but you wouldn't say that about an actual child.
Right.
That is like, it's okay to call an instant child that because they're a product. But yeah, whereas this is a human being. These are human beings that we're talking about here, and that extends to the instant children. So I thought that was a very interesting little moment, which again shows that balance of the levity and the lightness of touch with which this film plays with those themes, but yeah, that underlying darkness.
And that's what I miss about movies like this and products like this from that particular time. 70s too. 70s might even been darker because in the 70s, everything had, let's say, an apocalyptic climax, right? They're known for their disaster movies. You guys talk about disaster movies on your show a lot. There is just a relevant expected darkness at the end of 70s films, where this one, it does have the light at the end of the tunnel. It does have the cherry on top, but the darkness that it does put through in a kid's movie. I mean, this wasn't even a movie that like people would be watching in the theater. Like you said, this was afternoon child programming, which is where I think a lot of the nightmare fuel stuff that we remember from those days were seen, and why our parents didn't, because they were at work or they were in the kitchen and we were watching this shit and we were like, oh my God, Mom, what is this movie? Why am I scared? Why can't I sleep at night? And Conrad was one of those for me. It makes me miss those days. And I would love to see, and I've been saying this a lot, I love what A24 and Neon and Focus Features are doing. They're stepping away from the traditional model of what studios are doing with their storytelling and their scripts. When is someone going to start making darker family and children films like what we had in the 70s and 80s? I feel it's a missed market. And I feel like it's either Neon or A24 that can do it. Someone needs to go back and watch these films and be like, what can I do to speak to the children of today, to get them off their phones for a second and scare them, yet entertain them without being branded as full horror? I think we're missing this element in our culture today, and I want it back. Who knows? I might be the one to do it.
I think young kids really respond to that. So we've had little pockets of it, like over the last couple of decades. Like you say, nowhere near to the extent that we got it in the 70s and 80s. But I know that our niece loves Coraline, which maybe is and like Paranorman and these Leica Studios films that deal with horror and things in a child friendly way. But kids love that shit, and you're right. It's a totally untapped market at this point. So
I feel like Stranger Things. I feel like Stranger Things took a shot at it, but I think Stranger Things has been playing more for the nostalgia bait crowds like you and me, because it speaks to what we were seeing back then. It needs to learn how to tap into the younger market. So I'm not saying like a Stranger Things animated series would be the answer, but I feel that what we're looking at nostalgia bait wise, which is so popular right now, can easily be sidestepped into a younger market where they're just discovering it for the first time. Coraline's a perfect example, except I think Coraline was made for adults and not as much for kids, even though it is a kid's movie. But I think it's possible to tap that market. So yeah. Dude, this was an amazing conversation about these two great films. I appreciate you so much for bringing AI to the table, because honestly, I don't think I would have revisited it anytime soon had you not. And I'm so grateful that I did, because I'm seeing it with a whole new set of eyes. And the fact that I watched these two movies back to back on the same day to prepare for this show a few weeks ago, they really play well together. They are very different in tone and theme and production, of course, like that. But if you're looking at the metaphor, if you're looking at the under the surface message that both of these movies convey, they're alike enough and contradictive enough to make for a very interesting experience. And you can sit and have that debate with yourself and eventually have that conversation with someone else of like why movies like this don't get made anymore and why they are underrated and underappreciated.
It's a really interesting double bill, and I'm so grateful that you suggested Conrad, because that was a film that I just had very vague memories of, and revisiting it, I'm just like, do you know what? I pretty much am Bertie Bartolotti. Like somebody that I can relate to.
The movie is more queer coded than you think.
yeah, pretty much. But yeah, pairing the two of them together, I think they kind of speak to each other in interesting ways, I think.
Amazing. So before we let you go, let's get your socials, plug your show, and what you got coming up in the next few weeks.
Oh, thank you. So yeah, it's Once Upon a VHS, an 80s and 90s fantasy podcast. You can find us wherever you're listening to this. We've not got our YouTube sorted out yet, but you can catch us on Instagram, posting content at Once Upon a VHS. We're also on TikTok at Once Upon a VHS, and we've started a Blue Sky account as well. So we're across all of those, and yeah, give us a listen and see if you like what you hear. As Antonio mentioned earlier on, we did an episode with Doom Generation on Alice in Wonderland, a 1985 TV movie version of it. So if you like a mixture of like the deep cut fantasy stuff with, you know, some of the big hitters, then hopefully you'll find something that you enjoy. We are taking a little break over the festive season. We've got another couple of episodes, one about Anastasia that's coming out soon. And then after the break, we're going to be doing a themed season around the idea of heroes. And we're kicking that off with one of the major heavy hitters in the 80s fantasy canon, which is Willow.
And it's getting a 4K release really soon, so I'm excited about that. So we'll see that.
Yeah.
I'm going to throw out a suggestion. I'd love to hear you guys cover Canon Films' version of Hansel and Gretel. I did it on my show.
On my list to do. We're going to do witches soon. So
it's a trip. Okay, I'm looking for that one. And you can find a link to their show in the episode notes of this particular episode. And as for me, you know where to find me on all the socials. YouTube, please subscribe, like, review, 5 stars. Please do the same for Once Upon a VHS. We love getting those 5-star reviews. And take the time to write out a review, even if it's like 2 sentences. We love to get some feedback. So it was amazing having you on, and I hope to have this conversation again on another episode, maybe one of yours. I'd love to be on your show sometime.
Yeah, we'd love to have you as a guest. And thank you for today, Antonio. This has been a great chat.
Absolutely. Everyone, we will see you next week.